In October, a lad walked into the Nems record shop in the Whitechapel area of Liverpool and asked for a record called My Bonnie by the Beatles. The owner of the shop was Brian Epstein, and he'd never heard of the single or the group. Most people would have left it at that, but Brian prided himself on being able to get hold of any record his customers wanted. He was puzzled that he hadn't heard of this one and decided to look into it. The customer had mentioned that the record came from Germany, so he began with agents who imported foreign records. Although Brian was aware that there was a flourishing beat scene in Liverpool, he wasn't part of it. He was running one of the city's most successful record shops, and he certainly aimed to have every type of record in stock. But he preferred classical music. He loved Sibelius in particular, so he didn't go out to hear the beat groups. And since most of them had never made a record, he didn't come across them very often. Brian wrote and advertised regularly in Merseybeat, in which the Beatles were often mentioned and pictured, but he'd never noticed them. His interest in tracking down My Bonnie grew when 2 more customers came in and asked for it. He asked them who the Beatles were, and was surprised to discover that they weren't German, but a local group, who had often been in his store to spend an afternoon hanging round listening to records. He decided to go and see them for himself. It made sense for him to stock the record if they were popular locally. On November the 9th, 1961, Brian stepped gingerly inside the cavern for the lunchtime session. When the Beatles came on, he was fascinated. They were scruffy and cheeky. They smoked, ate, and chatted as they played. They shouted to friends, cracked jokes, and even turned their backs on the audience. They acted as though they didn't give a damn. But the kids in the cavern loved them, and it was clear to Brian that they had something special. Over the next couple of weeks, he saw the Beatles several times. He was fascinated by their energy and their talent, raw and disorganized as it was. As he watched them, an idea formed in his mind. He had joined his family retail business and made a success of both their record stores, but he was bored and he needed a new challenge. Perhaps the Beatles were what he was looking for. He talked to the boys and discovered their record was on the Polydor label, but that they had no manager and no record contract. He ordered 200 copies of My Bonnie, then started asking his contacts in the record industry what managing a group would involve. On December the 3rd, just over 3 weeks after he'd first seen the Beatles, he invited them to his office for a formal chat. John was immediately impressed by Brian. At 27, he was only 6 years older, but he couldn't have been more different. He wore smart suits, he was well off, and he owned a record shop. John wondered why a man like that had taken an interest in the Beatles, but he was more than willing to hear what he had to say. John took Bob Wooler, the Cavern MC, with him for support and introduced him to Brian as his dad. John thought it hilarious that Brian had believed him, and it was some time before Brian realized he'd been had. When Brian began to talk, John saw that he meant business. He was calm and to the point. He asked the boys where they wanted to go. They told him they were all certain they wanted a future in music and to be successful, but that they were frustrated because despite their popularity locally, nothing much was happening. A week later, Brian called them to his office again and told them he wanted to manage them. John trusted him straight away and was keen to agree, and the other 3 didn't take much persuading. A few days later, they signed a contract, giving Brian 25% of their earnings. They argued for less, but Brian pointed out that he'd probably be paying all their costs for months, if not longer, before they made any money. So the deal was done, and immediately Brian set about getting the boys to clean up their image and finding them a record contract. It was clear from the start that he was going to put all his energy into making them a success, and his determination impressed them. Over the next few months, John and Brian formed a close friendship. John thought Brian was sharp and that he knew what he was doing and could be trusted. He went to Brian's house regularly to talk to him about the direction the group should go in, and what they would need to do. I met Brian soon after he had signed the Beatles. He was charming, polite, well-spoken, and I liked him. He accepted that I was John's girlfriend, but he told John that it would be better if all girlfriends kept a low profile. I didn't mind because I had no interest in the limelight. As long as I could be with John, I was content to stay in the shadows. It didn't occur to us then that Brian was gay. Life must have been difficult for him. In the early 60s, if you were gay, you kept it secret. Gays were called queers and were disliked and distrusted by many. There was a huge amount of prejudice against them. Some accounts of that time claim that Brian was in love with John, which was why he wanted to manage the Beatles. I don't believe this for a second. They had a good relationship, but Brian cared for all the boys, and he wanted success for the group because he thought they had something unique. Claims have been made that Brian and John had a gay relationship. Nothing could be further from the truth. John was 100% heterosexual, and, like most lads at the time, horrified by the idea of homosexuality. When it was time for Dot and me to head for home, I was heartbroken. I would have loved to stay with John in Germany, but it wasn't possible. Mum and college were waiting for me, and John had a contract to fulfill. We hugged, cried, and kissed. As, laden with extra food to ensure that we didn't starve on the way home, we climbed back onto the train. Paul had bought Dot and himself gold engagement bands. She was thrilled. She was mad about Paul and hoped they'd get officially engaged when he came home. When John saw the rings, he said to me, "Perhaps we should get engaged too." I was pleased, but I wasn't worried about getting engaged. It all seemed too soon, and we were happy, so why change anything? At home, I regaled my mum with tales of what we'd been up to in Hamburg, editing out the pep bills, the wild nights, the knife fights, and anything else that would have horrified her. She also had news for me. My cousin and her husband were emigrating to Canada with their baby. They were both training to be teachers, and they wanted Mum to go with them to look after the baby, while they finished their studies and got jobs. Mum was torn. She loved the idea of seeing another part of the world and trying something new, but she felt she shouldn't leave me on my own. I was close to her and would miss her terribly, but I didn't want her to pass up an opportunity like that, and I knew I could cope. If she went, the main problem was where I would live. She would have to let the house for the income it would provide, and I didn't like the idea of living there alone anyway. There was an obvious solution. Mimi had taken in lodgers since her husband's death 7 years earlier, and had a vacancy. I hesitated. Mimi had made it abundantly clear that I wasn't her favourite person. On the other hand, I would see plenty of John. He was still living in the room he'd shared with Stuart, but at Mimi's I'd be much closer to him, and I knew Mimi would like the arrangement because John would come home more often. Mum agreed to go as long as I was settled. I waited until John came home from Hamburg a few weeks later, before I asked Mimi. He arrived back in a great mood. Everything had ended on a good note, and they had already been asked to go back. He loved the idea of me moving in with Mimi, and when we put it to her, she agreed immediately. When the rest of the boys came home, Stuart wasn't with them. He'd decided to stay with Astrid. He wanted to live with her, get married, make a new life for himself as a painter. Always his first love. A Scottish professor who was visiting the Hamburg Art College had taken an interest in his work, helped him into the art college, and even managed to get him a grant. It was clear he would become a successful artist, and I suspect he left the Beatles with little regret. Meanwhile, there had been a step forward for the group. During their time in Hamburg, while Dot and I were still there, the boys had made their first record. Tony Sheridan, whom they'd met on their first Hamburg trip, had a strong voice, and they'd often played as his backing band. So when it was suggested that they back him on a record, they leapt at the chance. The song, My Bonnie, was a corny old classic that the boys laughed at, and for some reason they were called the Beat Boys on the record. Perhaps the German producer thought Beatles didn't make sense, but still, it was a record, and the four were proud of it. Not that it sold many copies. When they got back, hardly anyone had heard of it. At the end of the summer term, not long after the boys had come home, I moved in with Mimi. I was in a little box room, barely big enough for the bed, but I didn't mind because with Stuart in Germany, John had moved back to Mimi's, so we were both there. With Mimi in the house, we didn't dare sneak into each other's rooms. We'd have been thrown out of the house instantly, but at least we saw a lot of each other. Living with Mimi was even harder than I had imagined it might be. Even though I was paying rent, I had to do any number of chores around the house, and she expected me to drop everything and come running to do her bidding. There was no refusing Mimi, and I was treated exactly as her other two lodgers. She always had a reason why she couldn't do a job herself or needed help. I gritted my teeth and did as she asked. I wasn't about to fall out with her and lose my room.